Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We want to go ahead and get started, Rod, or we want to wait a few minutes? Okay, great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. We're really excited to bring to you NCMEC presentation on online dangers and child sex trafficking, hosted by Belinda Swan. Super excited to hear all the great information that she's going to share today, and happy Friday. So thanks for being here. Belinda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Debbie, and thank you for having me. This is important information, and I am just continuously just so excited to see all of the ways the state of Texas comes together across agencies, across nonprofits, across school districts to recognize the importance of this issue. So thank you so much for having me. I'd like to make the best use of our time, so I'm going to jump right in. As Debbie mentioned, my name is Belinda Swan. I serve as a program manager for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I am housed at our Austin office located in Northwest Austin. And I have been with the agency for 3 years, serving as an outreach manager, which is how I met many of you. And now in a new capacity, I'm super excited to continue to share this messaging with you. But if you aren't familiar with the National Center, I'll quickly just give you a little overview, and then I really want to hit the ground running with some of the information I have for you today. But if you're not familiar with the National Center, we are a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1984. Probably our most famous or folks that you may recognize or associate with the National Center, two of our founders, John and Reve Walsh, who you may know from their work in this space, and especially because they also lost their own son, Adam, when he was just 6 years old. He was tragically abducted from a shopping center and later found deceased. And so it was that immense grief and that tragedy and that of other families that spurred the momentum to found this organization. And so almost 40 years later, we continue to evolve the ways that we deliver our programming, and we continue to recognize needs, and we continue to recognize those issues that directly affect our children, and try our very best to put together our resources and the data that we maintain by our tip line and our hotline, 1-800-THE-LOST, to continue to provide you with frontline information. And that's what we'll do today. So a little bit about our mission. It is three-pronged. It is to find missing children, which again, many of you may readily recognize us because of that part of our mission. You may remember, if you're a little older like myself, missing children's posters on the back of milk cartons, and that's certainly evolved. If you're interested in finding out more information, you can certainly visit our website. We have a portal where you can enter your zip code and pull up missing children's posters of those children in your area. And you are welcome to share those across your own personal social media feeds. We welcome it, actually. The more eyes we can have on these posters, the better. So probably the most recognizable way or tenet of our mission that resonates with you because it often receives the most attention, and rightfully so. Reducing child sexual exploitation, which is one of the topics we're going to discuss today, and preventing future victimization, which is again why we're all here. The more that we discuss these issues, the more that we educate one another, the more that we share information with each other, the more likely we are to be able to recognize a child in crisis and ultimately prevent a child from being victimized. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to share first and foremost that you absolutely have a new friend right here in Austin. If you have any questions, if I'm moving a little quickly, which I probably will do today just because I want to be respectful of your time. I know you have a day full of tasks and other things to do. So if there's a piece of information that you'd like to hear a little bit more about that you hear today, please, you will have access to my email address at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk generally about trafficking, then we're going to talk about some vulnerabilities, and then we're going to talk about some internet safety trends. So I'm going to move a little quickly through the trafficking components, and so that we can focus more on some trends and how those are linked or could have potential links to trafficking as well, and ways that we can work together to try to prevent some of those issues from happening. So I want to challenge you to consider, and if we were in person, I'd have you shout out your responses, but I want you to kind of think these through wherever you are. What comes to mind when you hear the term human trafficking? This is an actual screenshot of a Google search for the words human trafficking. And some of the themes that immediately pop up, as you can see on your screen, are these photos of actual bondage. So actual ropes, young children, and a few things that may have bubbled to the surface in your mind as you kind of process this image are that and this is important to recognize as we talk about vulnerabilities and other details throughout this presentation, are that the children mostly are presenting as white, and some, in a lot of the images, the hands tend to be darker. And so a lot of these kind of images and connotations play into kind of what we hear and see in movies and maybe in some sensationalized cases on TV. And again, every case is deserving of recognition and attention, obviously. But it's almost starts to create a narrative that, unfortunately, when we only fixate on some certain kinds or cases of trafficking, can lead us to overlook some of the issues that are happening in our own neighborhoods, right? In our own communities, at our own schools. So it's interesting to consider some of those kind of images that pop right up. And then as we progress through the presentation, some of the ways that we know and the areas where trafficking is happening. So keep this image in mind, and hopefully at the end of the day, you'll consider all of the different ways that this is happening, especially via the internet, so that we can work together to make sure that everyone is understanding of what is a fact and fiction and what lies in between, if that makes sense. So a little thought-provoking picture to get our conversation started. So what is child sex trafficking? It is, of course, it involves sexual activity with a child that is 17 and under. Proof of, and this is important to recognize, proof of force, fraud, or coercion is not required whatsoever. And it's important to recognize that a minor cannot legally consent to engage in a commercial sex act. Point blank, period. So you may encounter a child if you provide direct services or in your classroom or on your campus in whatever capacity that, maybe they're 14, 15, 16, and they've shared, no, I want to do this. I am okay with this. I don't need help. I don't want help. Legally, that is not a thing, right? This is a child that must be treated as a child, must be recognized as a victim of abuse. And so a couple of connotations, and again, and that's why we started with that exercise. Oftentimes, this fact can get misconstrued when details of the case are shared on social media and other facets, right? So it's always important to remember. And I think of the case, and full disclosure, Dateline junkie here, right? All kinds of television shows that highlight these cases. And there was a case several years ago that involved a young girl who was solicited online and was subsequently trafficked. But because her trafficker had her dressed a little bit more maturely, but because she seemed to have gone willingly, all kinds of these buzzwords that we hear, a lot of attention wasn't given to this particular case. And what gets lost is that at the core, there was an adult perpetrator and a minor child, right? And so it's important to remember that, again, proof of force, fraud, or coercion is not required, and that a minor cannot legally consent to engage in a commercial sex act. Movement is also not required. That's an important thing to consider. It's right there in the term, right? Human trafficking. And oftentimes folks assume that that means that this must occur, or it only counts as trafficking, or can only be recognized and treated as trafficking if a child is moved from one state to another or from one country to the other. And that's simply not the case. And we'll discuss that in greater detail in a second. And what is commercial sex? It is a sexual act exchanged for something of value. And that doesn't necessarily have to be cash, money. This can also be, of course, for some of our children that are experiencing homelessness, it can look like a safe place to stay for the night. It can look like access to clean clothes and food, basic necessities. It can also look like things like a gaming system, a cell phone, having your hair colored and cut, having your nails done, all of those kinds of things. Anything of value exchanged for a sex act is considered commercial sex. And that's important to distinguish as well. So a little bit about, again, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning of our discussion, the National Center mans 1-800 The Lost and our cyber tip line. And we receive millions of reports every year, millions of reports. But because we are a repository for those reports, we're able, as I mentioned, to take a look at that data and distinguish some trends and share some of that information with you. So all of the data reflected today simply reflect data reported to the National Center. But what I'd like to share with you is that 19% of the children reported missing to NCMEC who had run from the care of social services were likely victims of CST. And your mind's probably making those connections, right? So these are children who are especially vulnerable to trafficking. We received over 17,000 possible reports in 2021. And I'd like to note that our 2022 data will be released probably mid-March, I believe is the goal, and it'll be on our website, and we'll also have some social media highlighting that. And just as a side note, Debbie, I didn't forget, this particular presentation will be available for just a year on TEA's website because of this very reason. We like to make sure that you have access to updated information. So please know that updated data will be available in the coming weeks. And hopefully we'll be back again together next year to discuss this and other issues as well. So just wanted to point that out. NCMEC has responded to reports of CST in every single state. And it's also important to recognize that cases have been reported, cases that have been reported to NCMEC include victims of all gender identities. Often lost in the conversation is the fact that young boys absolutely get trafficked as well. You know, we don't necessarily have to get into a conversation as to why young boys aren't as likely to make an outcry, but we know that as a society, we have made it more difficult for young boys to feel that they can express those kinds of emotions or share that they have been sexually abused. So trafficking is no different. We know that young boys are being trafficked. They may not be as likely to make an outcry as young girls. So it's important for us as those trusted adults, those adults who have interaction and conversation with children on a day-to-day basis, to be able to recognize some of the signs and to be able to implement some prevention strategies as well. Again, just to highlight, this is a problem that's happening in rural, suburban, urban, and tribal lands. This isn't a Houston problem. This isn't just a Dallas problem or New York or Los Angeles. This happens everywhere in communities, small and large. You know, I've heard anecdotally and seen certainly reports where trafficking has occurred on the roping circuit, you know, at rodeos and, you know, wherever there are traveling events like carnivals and such, and we'll get into that in a second. But just, I want you to reframe maybe the way that, and again, going back to that initial slide, reframe some of the ways that we've been exposed to the idea of trafficking and considering what the data tells us. And it certainly tells us that it's happening everywhere. So one of the main things that I hope that you'll take away from today's discussion, I know I'm talking really quickly, but we have so much information to get to today, is that ultimately, child sex trafficking is child abuse. And I know that each and every single one of you has received training on how to respond when a child makes an outcry of any kind. And we have to remember that the way that we respond to a child who makes an outcry of trafficking, especially, you know, if they're little, well, always, but I want you to consider those instances where perhaps a child's a little older and looks like, you know, they are presenting in a way that says, you know, this was a choice. And again, we've already discussed and reemphasized that that's not true and that's not possible. It's legally not possible. We have to reframe how we discuss and view child sex trafficking as a form of child abuse. We would never tell a child who came to us with bruises on their body, who made an outcry and said, I'm being hurt at home by such and such. Well, maybe you should just stop then. What did you do? Why just, you know, just make better choices. We would never ever say those kinds of things to a victim of other types of abuse. So when we expand our understanding to include child sex trafficking as a form of child abuse, it also expands our ability to gather resources and to sincerely provide hope for a child who has been victimized. So let's change that thinking. And how can we start to change that thinking? By simply changing the way we refer to this type of victimization. You know, and again, I recognize we're all here because we have dedicated our careers, our livelihood to serving children, to educating children, to being that trusted adult, but we're all still human. So let's recognize that when we hear the words child or teen, prostitute, certain connotations ring true. And it's, you know, it's a little psychological, it's a little social conditioning, but when we hear the word prostitute, we kind of place blame on the victim. It kind of connotes that there is a willing participant in this sex act, right? And that, again, simply cannot be the case when we're discussing children and oftentimes adults as well, right? It places blame on the child victim rather than recognizing the perpetrator, which is, you know, again, and we'll get to that in a second, insinuates the child victim is a bad kid who has made poor choices. Again, when we hear that word prostitute, it almost puts the onus on the child. It infers that punishment's needed rather than compassionate care and a gathering of resources. And it also labels with the long-lasting stigma. So if this child perhaps did have an outcry, was recovered from trafficking, trafficking as a younger child and is thankfully still attending school and still trying to make their way. But we've maybe put in their file that they were a teen prostitute or a child prostitute. What's going to happen when the next person at the next school reads that? We're continuing that cycle of placing these labels that have these negative connotations. But what happens when we make just a very simple shift in language? When we go from saying things like child or teen prostitute to calling this by what this is, a child sex trafficking victim, what happens? I think our entire composure changes, doesn't it? We recognize that a child cannot developmentally, socially, or legally make a choice in commercial sex. It defines that what has happened to the child rather than labeling the child. And perhaps most importantly, it labels a victim and a child in need of support and services. And not only that, but it also identifies if there's a victim, there's a perpetrator. And in this case, there is an adult perpetrator and there is a call for justice, a justice response, so that we can find this perpetrator victimizing other children. So again, that slight shift in language really opens us up to considering all of the ways that we can work together to provide resources for the child. So for me, every time I provide this presentation to different groups, I really sincerely hope that this one small tidbit of information, this small shift in language will be effective and will be something that you remember. So please consider moving forward. Let's remove child prostitute and teen prostitute out of our vocabulary, and let's call this by what it is. Let's remember that there are child victims behind these crimes. So what does this look like? Where does this happen? As I mentioned, I gave you a few little anecdotes before. Large traveling events, absolutely, where there's an opportunity for folks to come into town and leave quickly. Those are certainly opportunities for traffickers to find and exploit child victims. Internet and streaming, which is obviously what we're going to focus on today. Schools are where the children are, and traffickers certainly know that. Hotels and motels at home, familial trafficking certainly is an issue. In strip clubs, these are just a few illustrative examples based on reports that we receive at the National Center. So again, let's expand the way we think about this crime in all of the different places. And doesn't this lend itself to what we said earlier, that this happens in communities small and large, and in cities both urban and rural? What does this look like? I have a video for you that I'd like to share. If you haven't seen it already, it's pretty impactful. I never get tired of seeing this video because I think it does such a good job of highlighting all of the ways that this can happen, especially when we consider that anyone can be a victim, and even those children who we would never, for whatever kind of self or reasons that we may have or projections we may have, a child that we would say, oh, this would never happen to her, right? So let's watch the video and then we'll talk a little bit more about this.
Okay, everyone can are you gonna leave your Can anyone tell me what the different chromosome is for a male versus a female? Yes.
XX is female and XY is male.
Correct?
This is those up here.
No, it's down.
We're trying to study.
What is this?
Nothing.
What is this? What are you
Nothing.
doing?
It's nothing.
Who is that?
Nobody.
Who is that? Who are you texting?
What's your problem? Come on, let's go. Hey, it's gonna be fun. Come over here.
That video comes by way of one of our amazing partners, A21. Let's all take a deep breath. That's a lot to digest. And it's certainly, again, we are a group of folks who've dedicated our livelihood to serving children. And so that can be very hard to watch, period. So let's take a deep breath and kind of recenter. And let's consider some of the key points and key takeaways from that video. One of the things that I think we can agree that we all noticed right away is that the young girl continued to go to school even after the victimization had started to take place over a period of time. And I think one of the other key takeaways too is also that the teacher recognized that something was wrong, but couldn't quite pinpoint it, right? So hopefully by the end of today's discussion, not only will you feel empowered with what to look for and what to do when you see it, but you'll trust your gut. Trust your gut. If you see something that you consider or that you think something's just not right, speak up, call us over at the National Center. We're happy to work that through with you. But anyway, another key takeaway also was the way that the perpetrator found the young girl was through social media. It's sending those direct messages. What made this particular child vulnerable? She was going to school, clearly very smart, clearly had a concerned parent at home who's home to cook dinners and make sure she's doing her homework. So what went wrong per se? Well, what makes a child vulnerable, and we'll go through some of those, an exhaustive list of some of the different vulnerabilities, is also that she's simply a child. Simply being a child makes one vulnerable. Not only are they fully developed, but also consider yourself, excuse me, at that age and kind of the things that are important to you, fitting in, feeling like you belong, and certainly having the attention of someone a little older who may, be attractive and may be our first exposure to a relationship and sex and all of these other kinds of things that children are naturally curious about as they continue to grow older. A trafficker can certainly exploit all of those things and normalize behaviors for them that are extremely unhealthy, which were all illustrated in that video. So again, who can become a victim of CST? All gender identities, sexual orientations, nationalities, races, ethnicities, socioeconomic classes, and education levels. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is an issue of vulnerability, manipulation, and control. Some of these issues of vulnerability are more pronounced than others, but oftentimes, as I mentioned, it's simply an issue of a child being a child. At our core, we want to feel loved, we want to feel attractive, we want to feel that we belong, we want to feel that we matter to someone, and traffickers certainly are fully aware of that. So I think all of us here in the call are probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And why do we share this with you? It's because, as I just mentioned, traffickers absolutely know how to exploit our most vulnerable and know how to exploit any one of the kinds of needs that a child may be indicating that isn't being met. So what the hierarchy of needs postulates is that essentially that no one can progress to the next level of self-actualization until the first level is met, and so on and so forth. So at the very bottom are our physiological needs, safety. So we can't even consider whether or not we are safe, if we feel safe, if we don't know where our next meal is coming from, if we don't know where we're going to sleep tonight. And we certainly can't even begin to consider being loved and feeling like we belong if we don't have food to eat and a safe place to stay. Self-esteem, what's self-esteem when you are too busy trying to survive, when you're too busy trying to access those basic needs? And finally, self-actualization. So what do traffickers provide? Well, they recognize these needs, these deficiencies. They can provide food, clothes, or shelter. They can provide a false sense of security, a place to stay. They provide a false sense of family. They provide false dreams and goals, and they certainly provide false hope. right? So these are all of the ways that we could recognize in children on our own campuses where there's some deficiencies, what makes a child especially vulnerable. We know that all children are vulnerable point blank, but are there children perhaps that may be at more risk based on these deficiencies? Are there resources in our local community that I can reach out to make sure that this particular child has access to things like food over the weekend, a new backpack when school starts, a new pair of shoes so that he or she isn't picked on or feels more empowered to show up to school? Certainly anecdotally, and I'm sure each and every one of you can provide a presentation on all of the ways that children have been discouraged from attending school. Certainly heard instances where, well, I didn't have clean clothes and we didn't have money to go to the washateria or a ride, so I just didn't go, right? So all of these kinds of deficiencies are also huge opportunities for traffickers to come in and save the day. So again, just to reiterate, traffickers target a child who, especially who's experiencing homelessness. Again, they're providing all of these basic needs, has a history of childhood sexual abuse or assault, is missing or runs away, is in a family with severe substance abuse or family engaged in commercial sex. I often share, I grew up in a small town, in a small rural town in South Texas, and certainly everybody knew everyone. And there were these, not so well-kept secrets around town about some of the different issues that families were going through. And I often wondered, what if we stopped talking about the way that these things were happening and came together to help these families, right? So if you're in a position where we can mobilize resources to address these issues, we can potentially save a child from being victimized. A child who's been kicked out or stigmatized by their family because they identify as LGBTQ+. If a child comes out at, let's say, 13, and then their family says, well, you no longer have a home here. Well, they don't have the ability to work, identification, access to food, access to clothing, access to anything. Traffickers certainly recognize that. Mental health conditions, if there are already systems involved, this increases their vulnerabilities. If they're undocumented or an unaccompanied minor or impacted by systemic racism. All of these issues amplify what we already know, that simply being a child makes one vulnerable. So I'm going to go through these quickly. As I mentioned, you can certainly send me an email and we can talk through these in greater detail at a later date, but I want to make sure we get to some of our internet safety trends and talk about some resources. So I'm going to do a quick time check here. So again, social and environmental factors, familial factors, and individual factors certainly make a person vulnerable. And we'll go quickly through a list of some of these items. You can see here some examples of societal indicators. I apologize. Bullying, that lack of resources that continues to bubble to the surface, involvement in child welfare, juvenile justice. All of these things are societal factors that can make a child even more vulnerable. Familial issues, as we indicated just a couple of slides back, that housing instability and homelessness is such a huge indicator. And so if we know that we have kiddos on our campus that are experiencing homelessness, are we working across, are we assigned to MDTs, multidisciplinary team in our county to share resources, to make sure that we're connecting children and families with those local resources? ACEs, absolutely. Individual factors include a history of trauma, lack of supportive family or adult figures. So again, we've seen instances certainly where children living behind gated communities with seemingly all of the resources in the world have been trafficked. And it's not necessarily because, again, on that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because they were lacking food, shelter, safety, but perhaps their self-esteem is not where, in a place where they would be able to confidently, fend off some of these attempts by traffickers and groomers to get their attention, right? Perhaps there's that lack of supportive family or adult figures. Maybe in that particular family, love is expressed through material things, but the child is lacking in other ways. So these individual factors also make children vulnerable to trafficking. And so we're going to start to get into some discussions about internet safety trends and how this kind of coincides, what we need to do, what we need to be looking for. So grooming essentially describes the process by which a predator is able to gain access to a child, and in this instance, to traffic the child. So let's consider social media. A perpetrator may cast a very wide net. So for instance, in the video that we watched, a perpetrator may send the same direct message across all kinds of social media platforms to hundreds of children. The perpetrator just needs one child to respond to that message of, you're so pretty, or you're hot, or I know you're a little bit younger, but you're so beautiful. Where do you go to school, right? All of these kinds of things. So what happens when we haven't had a discussion about internet safety with our children, when we haven't prepared them to be able to recognize what's healthy and what's not, what's okay and what's not? Well, if we haven't had a conversation about those issues, if we haven't explained to children why it's so important to set their privacy settings on their social media profiles, again, all it takes is one time for a perpetrator to receive a positive response to their messages, for that perpetrator to say, okay, great, this kid responded to me, this is their handle, this is their name, all of their social media profiles are wide open, so I can take a look at where they go to school, where they live. I can read up and see what food they like, what music they like, what sports they're into. I can see daily updates about where they are and who they're with and what they like to do, whether or not they're getting along with their family, all of those kinds of things. When we don't talk to kids about internet safety and their approach to online, it's so easy for these perpetrators to have all of the information that they need to start to create a false sense of friendship with the child. They have that information, they have that green light, they were able to get the attention of the child, so now they can start to create that faux friendship, right? Oh, I love such and such music or such and such food, or did you catch that game last night? I love that, me too. Or, oh, are you having a bad day? You can talk to me, all of those kinds of things. So they start to establish that friendship based on information provided by the child and what they can find online. And then they start to, and you saw this in the video as well, then they start to really make the child believe that they're in a loving relationship. And in that particular video, we saw that this poor young girl really thought she was the only one. She was in love. This is the greatest thing that's ever happened to her. But as soon as that trust, that trust and loving bond, which obviously we know is not based on a healthy, loving, trusting relationship, as soon as the perpetrator feels that they have their hooks essentially in this way with the child, then the abuse starts. Maybe they start to pull back a little bit. And as you saw in the video, he certainly started to expose her to sex. He started to expose her to trafficking. He started he was with other girls in front of her and normalized all of these behaviors after he got the young girl to believe and trust in him. And oftentimes this starts as simple as an online direct message or a comment on a profile picture. When we're not, this isn't the only way it happens, obviously, but for the sake of today's conversation, when we're not having conversations about internet safety and what's appropriate and inappropriate online, we are just simply missing a huge opportunity to prevent victimization. So I'm going to show you some pictures, and I want you to consider who you think some of these folks from this list, from this variety of pictures of wonderful, upstanding citizens, which of these folks do you think are traffickers? If we were in person, I'd have you raise your hand and yell out to me, but think about this for a few seconds. And while you're considering who you think may be the traffickers, I'll share with you that all of them are traffickers. We shared this slide because it's important to highlight to you that there is no particular typology. Anyone can be a trafficker. I'll quickly share that a couple of these folks, number 4 and number 9 specifically, absolutely use social media to find their child victims. And again, it can start as simply as commenting on that photo, sending that direct message. We're not preparing our children on how to fend off these unwanted messages. We're not telling them how to set their security settings on their online profiles, or they're gaming online without any clear direction about what's acceptable. Traffickers know that. They cast a wide net. They go where the kids are. I will share with you, just so that you are aware, I can provide links to news cases about every single one of these folks, but quickly I'll share number 1. She was on a show called Smallville. Her name is Allison Mack, and she was an actress who was actually she was a member of a cult that was recruiting young girls for trafficking purposes. Number 2, trafficked underage girls. And number 3, this is heartbreaking, but he actually was in California. He was a SPED instructor, and he was specifically assigned to young boys with IDD. He was also a foster parent to young boys of IDD. He was recognized in the community as an upstanding, individual who was taking on these children that no one else wanted. what he was doing, unfortunately, behind closed doors was absolutely horrific. He trafficked these young boys, utilized the internet to do so. He's in prison for the rest of his life, thank goodness. Number 5, owned a massage parlor in the Dallas area and was trafficking women and young girls out of her business. Number 6, trafficked her own 2 young daughters, age 6 and 4, or 5 and 4, from her home. So another example of familial trafficking. Again, challenging those assumptions, some of that narrative that we're fed via movies and other TV shows about what trafficking looks like, that blinds us to how it's actually happening. I'll share quickly that number 8 put out a social media ad looking for models for his upcoming music video, but what he was essentially looking for were young girls to traffic. And so again, that nexus of social media, that nexus of quick and easy access to children online, plays over and over again in a lot of the cases that we see. Finally, I'll share that number 10 was a prominent businessman. I believe he was on the school board, I believe in Kentucky, and he would frequently visit the local recovery center where young girls and women were recovering from addiction. And that's where he found his victims. He manipulated their weaknesses to traffic these young girls. But I want to share with you that it took one brave 16-year-old to make an outcry to school staff to take him down. So when we are prepared, when we're educated, when we make sure that we are those trusted adults in our communities, even if we don't readily recognize what's happening in a child's life, if we just continue to be a consistent presence, hopefully a child will recognize us as trusted adults and speak up to us when they can. So again, here, the point is just to reiterate that a trafficker can be anyone. Let's challenge those misconceptions, and let's make sure that we aren't missing an opportunity to help a child who's being victimized. As you saw in these examples, traffickers can include family members. Certainly happens with gangs, and pimp-controlled trafficking is probably the one that's most readily recognized and available or illustrated in the news and on movies and just in our culture, quite frankly. I think that the word pimp has been kind of taken over so much so that it's such a part of the vernacular, that behind it, that what's actually happening, the victimization that's happening behind it actually gets lost, but certainly still one of the ways that trafficking happens. And unsure buyer facilitated. So this can be a child who maybe is on the streets, again, a child who's been kicked out of the house, or who's run from care, who's simply run from abuse in the home, so on and so forth, who is on the streets and not necessarily being controlled by a pimp or a gang or a family member, but is on their own and is being sexually exploited. So these are just a quick overview of the traffickers and where do traffickers find their victims. Here's an exhaustive list, well, not an exhaustive list, but gives us a pretty good idea of some of the places and ways that traffickers find their victims. But I want to especially focus on number 1, which is online. And again, we've talked about a few of those examples. And how do they control their victims? And you're going to recognize these methods as some of the ways that some of the other children that you've come into contact who've been abused in other ways have been controlled, right? So why didn't they speak up? Why didn't they say anything? Well, oftentimes, just as with other types of abuse, there are threats made, right? I'm going to, harm you or your family, or if there's anybody that matters to this young child, that can certainly be used as leverage to continue to manipulate the child. Isolation, again, that young girl, in the video, started to withdraw. She wasn't raising her hand in class. She was distracted. She wasn't participating. She was still showing up, but she was certainly becoming more and more isolated, withholding and destroying documents like IDs and so on and so forth. Absolutely use of shame and self-blame, manipulation through trauma bonding, all of the different ways that we recognize that victims consistently are manipulated and controlled by their perpetrators. A couple of indicators, I'll share these lists with you quickly so that we can move on and get to some of the internet safety trends that I want to address today. But you can certainly recognize several of these huge red flags that you may see in some students on your campuses. And, together, any one of these or any combination of these are certainly cause for concern and consideration and conversations with staff and with all of the resources at the ready to try to intervene. So here is a pretty good list of some of the physical indicators that may present when a child is being trafficked. I'd like to also share or highlight quickly, close association with an overly controlling adult is an important one. And so this may not look like, like a mom like me who's at school every chance that she can volunteer, or who is overly involved in school activities, but can look like when the child and the adult are together, the child will look at he or she first when asked a question, will, not give you eye contact, and, these kinds of just uncomfortable, again, just like in that video, the teacher knew something was amiss, but just couldn't quite figure out what that was. Trust your gut. Some behavioral indicators, which I think are super important to add to the conversation. I want to highlight especially if a child is using language or emojis often associated with commercial sex, like the life or a trick or the game, especially if they're a little younger, this is a red flag. Maybe just gently push back a little and say, what does that mean? Where did you hear that word? It's important to follow up on those gut instincts and ask questions and try to see whether or not this child needs resources, and whether or not we need to just ring the bell that it's time to investigate a little bit further. So as you saw in the video, stops engaging in activities they previously enjoyed, abruptly disconnects from family and friends. So many of these indicators are huge red flags. It's something's going on, and we need to work together to make sure that we can have these conversations and say, you know what? Went to this presentation, had some additional training as well. This child is presenting X, Y, and Z. What can we do as a team here on campus to try to intervene and assist this child? So how do we protect the kids in our lives, right? In order to prevent child sex trafficking, we have to build relationships with our children and prevent them from being targeted or at risk. So that certainly goes into a deeper conversation about having those resources together. Are we actively engaged with nonprofits in the local area that provide, again, food, that provide those backpacks, those school supplies? Are we making that messaging available to parents in English and other languages that may be appropriate, that these resources are available? Are we having the kinds of conversations with children that will maybe allow us to gain more information from the child about what they need, right? That's not always easy. It can be very embarrassing and difficult for some children to say, you know what, we don't have food at home. But when we continue to serve as that trusted adult and create those bonds with the children in our care and on our campuses, we will start to facilitate more two-way conversation. So what are some protective factors that we can strive to make sure are in place? Supportive family environments, obviously, that's not something that we can readily do for a lot of the children on our campuses, but we can create healthy boundaries. For a lot of children who've been victimized, they've never actually understood or been explained or been exposed to what healthy boundaries and relationships look like. So what does that look like in practice? For us, it can be as simple as, no, I will not follow you on Snap, and no, you cannot have my Instagram handle. I'm your teacher, I'm your principal, and I'm invested in you, and I'm so excited that you have asked me to do so, but we will not do, that is not part of our friendship and our relationship. You can tell me all about the things that you want to, but this is a boundary we're setting, right? Or no, you cannot have my personal cell phone number. We can talk here, those kinds of things, whatever just, policy dictates your interaction with students. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that when we set what it looks like to have a healthy relationship with an adult, we're setting a standard that will help a child to recognize what's not a healthy relationship. That's the takeaway there. Of course, abide by the policies at your district, but keep in mind that when we are doing so and being vocal about it and explaining to children why these boundaries exist, we're setting a template and a foundation for children to recognize what's not a healthy boundary with an adult. Those stable relationships. I say this all the time. If you're telling your kiddos you're going to go to that basketball game, we've got to show up to that basketball game, right? And if we don't, we have to have a very good reason. Let's be there day in and day out. Let's make good on the things that we promise to children so that they recognize us as trusted adults. We're already in positions of oftentimes just because of our title: teacher, principal, school counselor, safety coordinator, school resource officer. Oftentimes our title simply gives us elevates us to trusted adult status. But let's also do so in action and in words so that our children feel more compelled when they are in trouble or when they have questions to speak up to us and to share their questions with us as well. Again, fulfillment of basic needs and simply being that caring adult. Sometimes it's as simple as, good morning, how are you? That's it. We've heard several times from a lot of the survivors that we work with that just simply asking those kinds of questions and doing so with a smile on our face consistently was enough for a child to feel that one person cared enough about their well-being to keep on going to school, to keep on trying. And we know that. We see that over and over again. But let's hear a little bit from survivors.
One of the things that my daughter always says, she's like, Mom, you're my best friend. She's like, I can come to you and talk to you about anything. And I give her sound advice. I'm not judgmental. So if she asks me something, I ask her, so what do you think about it? How do you think you're gonna? So I really don't give her the answer. I try to have her find that for herself. But just asking questions. Ask questions and get to know your child.
For parents, I would say, you have to set aside whatever's going on with you. If you're embarrassed or whatever's going on, you have to set it aside. You have to make sure that your child gets the best services available to him or her to help them overcome what's just happened.
Well, I tried to tell my parents several times when it first started happening. I would throw questions out to my mom and dad, like, well, are you supposed to touch somebody when they're doing something to help you? But are you supposed to do this? With my dad, I would say the same thing. I said, are you supposed to touch somebody in their private area for them helping you? And are they supposed to be leaning up on you on your shoulder with their private area and rubbing this, that, and the other on you? My dad would say, boy, stop lying. What in the word are you talking about? Things like that.
You need to focus on yourself, and you need to figure out what services do you need to help yourselves overcome in the healthiest way possible for you and for your child and for any other siblings in the house.
The role of an adult is to be an adult. If you're the adult and you notice a change, start the conversation, ask the specific questions, and don't go around a circle around the corner about it. Just be upfront and blunt about it.
I know sometimes we get busy and we get caught up with our day-to-day, but the most important thing is being an active person in our children's life, and that is very important.
While that video was geared toward parents, I was sharing with Rod earlier, I still felt that it was relevant and important to hear from survivors what not only they are committing to in their own lives with their children, but what they wished they had when they were being victimized. And I think it's fair to say that although we certainly aren't the parents of the children on our campuses, we can absolutely create an environment where children feel compelled to speak up, to ask questions. And I love what one of the survivors said. We're the adults, so we have to act like the adults. If we see something, speak up, ask follow-up questions, secure those resources, share information about the available resources in your community with your families and students. All of these protective factors in place, I assure you, will help us to the greater goal of preventing at least one more child from being victimized. So let's get to know the children on our campuses. Let's open those lines of communication. Let's be present, discuss and monitor online safety, and discuss the dangers of CST. And even if you're not able to discuss the dangers of CST specifically with your students, simply being aware of what those dangers are, simply being aware of some of those red flags that we've discussed today is such a huge help in this continued goal, again, to recognize, address, and prevent these issues. So let's talk a little bit about internet safety. At the crux of a lot of the cases, the video, all of the kinds of things that we've talked about today is the fact that perpetrators simply know where to find children, and children are online. Nothing is going to go back to the way that it was before COVID. We're here virtually. I continue to do a lot of my work virtually. We all do. It's simply a low-cost, easy way to get business done, and children socialize in this way as well. So we have to recognize first and foremost that internet safety is child safety. It has to be embedded into our conversations. We cannot say that we've done enough about childhood safety when we talk about what to do when someone approaches them or is inappropriate with them in person, and not extend that conversation to what to do and what to recognize when someone is inappropriate with them online. So at the base of internet safety is making sure that we're connected, that we continuously learn about what children are doing, what they're engaged with, and continuously be engaged by having those conversations. One of the things I shared yesterday at a conference was that how many of us in the room and how many of us on this call know that TikTok is out. TikTok is not where the kids are anymore, right? It's so last 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And when you ask kids why, it's because we're on TikTok now, right? I've had kids tell me, well, yeah, well, grandma's literally on TikTok showing videos and dancing, like we're done. You know what I mean? So right when we think that we're catching up to kiddos, right when we think we have a grasp, I assure you we don't. So how can we stay on top of that is by, again, connecting, learning, and engaging, having conversations and making sure, again, that we're extending basic common sense safety discussions to internet safety as well. And why is this more important than ever? I'll share with you, as I mentioned earlier, we receive millions upon millions of reports to our cyber tip line. And from 2020 to 2021, and we absolutely saw a huge spike through the height of pandemic closures, but nothing changed from 2020 to 2021 as things kind of sort of went back to whatever normal is now. We still saw this huge spike in reports to the cyber tip line. This is troublesome. Behind every single one of those reports is an instance of a potentially sexually exploited child. And what are some of the trends that we're seeing? We continue to see a huge increase in overall online enticement, but things that I assure you are impacting kids on your campuses with regard to their online behavior, sexting. We partnered with Thorn, and I can certainly share a link with you, Rod, to share with everyone on the call, but the Thorn organization does amazing work. They continue, one of the things that sets them apart, which is difficult, as we all know, as educators and so on and so forth, is to actually carry out studies with access to children. And they do that year after year after year to gauge kind of opinions and attitudes toward the relationship with the internet and sexual activity. And so we continue to see the needle moving younger and younger and younger. Kids 6, 7, 8, 9, right? So consider if we're providing tablets, devices as educators or in our own lives, if we think a child is old enough to have access to the internet, they're old enough to have these internet safety conversations. So we're starting to see a huge increase in sextortion instances. We actually worked with the FBI just about a little over a month ago to release a national public safety notice about sextortion, and it specifically it affects all age ranges and so on, but it's specifically we're seeing a spike in young boys. So young boys are especially being sextorted. Think about what young boys like to do. Oftentimes they like to game, they play online, they're communicating with strangers to try to get to that next level, to accumulate more points, and so on and so forth. Perpetrators know this. Again, perpetrators know what kids like, what they're into, where to find them. We need to be right there with them to make sure that we are able to have these conversations and that we're aware of some of the ways that perpetrators can gain access to children. So sexting, online enticement, sextortion, and live streaming, youth-produced content is seen in children in all ages. Again, that sounds awful, but when we consider how young children are when we initially expose them to smart devices and to the internet, it starts to make sense, doesn't it? We see it across all platforms, so I can't tell you with any confidence that one app is better or worse than the other. It's on all platforms. It's an access issue. I wanted to share this quickly with you, and then we'll talk about some resources. Want to make sure we've got some time here. But again, our partners at Thorn, I think this is really important for all of us to understand as we kind of wrap up for today. So we talked a lot about child sex trafficking. We talked a lot about vulnerabilities. We talked a lot about some of the different red flags to look for. We talked about all of the ways that this can happen and by whom and so on and so forth. But what I really want you to consider as well is that while all of these issues are going on, so is this increase online of children recognizing or continuing to put importance on their online relationships. So while we have all of these issues with trafficking happening, and we know that oftentimes perpetrators find or attempt to make contact with children online, while that's happening, we also have an increase in children who continue to put importance on their online friendships and relationships. So we have to understand where our children are so that we're able to help to prevent these issues and so that we can have honest conversations with our kids. And that's why I wanted to share this information with you. You can see the full study on Thorn's website. But take a look at some of these key takeaways from their work. Online relationships can be quite personal and meaningful. And for 1 in 3 young people, their closest friendships formed online. Did you know that? Were you aware? I'm sure for most of us you were. But let's sit with that for a moment, right? So how do we project our relationships with the internet onto children? Does that create a blind spot for us? So that isn't true for us, and we don't game, and we're sick of the internet by the time we're done with our workday. Are we projecting kind of that relationship onto what we assume kids are doing? We can't do that anymore. We have to understand where kids are. We have to understand how important their online relationships and friendships are, and make sure that we're speaking to them about how to do so safely, right? We've got to continue to have conversations with our kids about how to be safe online. Flirting and dating, and you probably have already read this as I have spoken, online are viewed as common, even when it involves an adult or someone much older. So you can see how that door is just ajar this much. When we don't have these conversations, they already recognize this as somewhat normal. And so that door being just open just a little bit is just wide enough for a perpetrator, right? We've got to close that door and fill that with information and with trusted relationships and empowering our children to speak up. So 1 in 3 9 to 12-year-olds believed it was common to flirt with other minors, and 1 in 5 believed it was common to date a young adult online. 9 to 12-year-olds, right? And we continue to see an upswing in that percentage of 9 to 12-year-olds year after year after year. Again, socialization online is becoming more and more common, establishing friendships. What's not is our ability to keep up and to continuously provide that two-way conversation. But that changes today, right? Because we're all going to leave here empowered. We're all going to leave here knowing what to do. Being made to feel uncomfortable by an online connection does not guarantee a minor will be ready to cut off contact. I want you to consider that. Consider our day-to-day interactions with our own friends and people we consider important to us. If they say or do something that upsets us, we're probably 99% of the time, if they matter to us, we're going to overlook that, we're going to talk through that, and we're going to move on. And that's certainly happening with children online as well. So just because something uncomfortable may happen online doesn't necessarily mean the child's going to cut off contact. So again, we have to fill in those gaps with information about healthy relationships and safer online behavior. And again, it's important to note that with LGBTQ plus youth, they're more than twice as likely, at least based on this study, as likely to be in this position. This does not in any way, shape, or form indicate that children who identify as LGBTQ plus are more sexually active or engaged. It simply means that for a lot of children, they feel that they can find community and friendships and engagement online more so than in person. So statistically, you're going to see some of these numbers look a little different. So just felt that I needed to share that with you. So overall, online grooming, examining risky encounters amid everyday digital socialization is the name of the study. That's a mouthful, but so many wonderful tidbits to help us to understand where our children are with regard to their relationship to the internet and their socialization. We cannot even begin to address this problem if we don't understand how meaningful these friendships and relationships are and how common some of these red flags are in their day-to-day interactions. So now that I've scared everyone, let's talk about some ways we can work together to implement internet safety and to have these conversations. NetSmarts is our hallmark internet safety program. All of our resources are free. You will never pay for a single training or resource at the National Center. We have presentations for children K through 12. We have coinciding presentations for the adults in the lives of children so that everyone is receiving the same information about the dangers, the red flags, and the ways to prevent these issues. You can find these on our website. They're available in English and Spanish. We have a ton of tip sheets as well. We've talked about what it means to be a trusted adult. We have a tip sheet about that, how to respond when a child asks particular questions or makes an outcry. Here's a snapshot of some of the different presentations available on our website. We also have coinciding speakers guides and talking points. So we are never going to send you out into the world without some sort of template for engaging in these meaningful conversations about these behaviors. And again, you can download those today in English and in Spanish. A little bit more quickly, some other resources. Again, as I mentioned, those tip sheets are so valuable. You can leave them out in your staff lounge for folks to pull and read at their leisure. They're on our website. You can email me and we can send you copies as well. Activity guides, we have some downtime, right? When do you have downtime? But if you need to fill a gap in some area, you can certainly download some of our activity guides. Again, I can mail some. If you're local to Austin, I can take you some. Coloring books, word mazes, all kinds of fun activities to reinforce safer internet practices, online games as well. If you do do, issue tablets and Chromebooks and so on, you can consider preloading those tablets with NetSmarts and some of those games for younger children so that they are exposed to online safety practices as well. Peer education and leadership kits for our older students. Rod, we talked yesterday, some amazing kids or older children at yesterday's conference. And again, we know that oftentimes kids want to hear from those cool kids in high school rather than from the old people, right? Well, let's take advantage of that and prepare and educate our older students with information on how to talk to younger kids about internet safety. So many free resources for you at your disposal. Download them today. For kids 10 and under, I highly recommend utilizing Into the Cloud. We have 2 seasons of this streaming internet show. Each episode comes with a detailed discussion guide. We even have a teacher's toolkit on how to implement lessons associated with each episode, again, available in English and Spanish. You saw the statistics, you saw the information from Thorn, kids as young as 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, already being exposed to some of these hazards, already being exposed to some of this online manipulation. We have to prepare them with the information. We have to empower them and make sure that our kiddos are better situated to be safer online. And so we can start that as young as 5 years old. And you can find all of this information and more, as I mentioned. I'll leave you with this. If your school district, or maybe outside of your job, your role as a community leader, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, a faith-based organization, if you'd like to partner with the National Center, our Community Education Partner Program is a fantastic way to do so. We provide you with training and technical assistance on how to deploy those presentations and ongoing opportunities for learning. And finally, Take It Down is our newest resource. We just cannot talk about this enough. We are so excited about this resource. You can now, as you can see, it is geared towards those folks who would like to discreetly do something about their images. They know that their images are online. It used to be even 10 years ago where it was difficult to offer hope to kiddos because there weren't a lot of ways to track and remove these images and videos from the internet. That's not the case anymore. We can provide children with hope. If a child makes an outcry to you, please point them to this website. Please point them to the National Center. Consider filing a report with us so that we can provide them with all of the resources on hand. And as I mentioned, we work with all the big players, Meta, Snap, so on and so forth, to remove those images. You can, if a child makes an outcry or someone in your own personal circle is experiencing an issue, you can come to our website, make a cyber tip line report, or if they're not ready to go that far just yet, they just want information on how to address the images or the bullying that's happening on a particular platform, they can click on any one of these tabs, and in detailed instructions on how to make a report to that particular app will pop right up. Again, a lot of our districts or where we live, simply not very resource heavy. Let us help you. We provide crisis intervention, peer support network, mental health and community support referrals, so on and so forth. And all of these supports are free. So again, when in doubt, something's not right, make that first step by giving us a call or filing a cyber tip line report. We'll circle back with you and hash it out. For youth to hear us, they need to feel respected as individuals, supported and encouraged, heard, like we care, and valued and special. So again, sometimes it's just like, good morning, how are you, consistently on a daily basis. It's having some of these materials and resources, some of these posters tagged up on our wall. Don't have to say a word, you just tag it up there. And if that kid is ready, that kid is having an issue, they know that you're someone they can trust to talk about that issue. So let's work together. I hope that you'll consider utilizing our resources, and remember, observe, report, and advocate. If you have any questions about anything we discussed today, if you'd like to seek additional training, flesh out this presentation, we have free online training as well. These are the kinds of things that you can report to the National Center. But if you're not sure if it fits into any one of these categories, just give us a call. We'll walk you through it anytime, day or night. We also work with language lines, so that is never a barrier either. Here's my contact information. If you'd like to request materials that I mentioned, coloring books, activities, whatever, so on and so forth, send us an email at outreach@ncmec.org, and we'll get that shipped to you at no cost, of course. But if you'd like to reach out to me specifically and ask follow-up questions, or if there's something on your mind you'd like to flesh out, please send me an email. I'm happy to connect with you. That is my time. I know I spoke super fast and we covered a lot, but if you have any questions, please do let me know. Rod, I see that the chat's been active, so I'm happy to answer those questions if we have time.
I hate to say most of the chat is me trying to post resources and be able to guide people to all the resources that you addressed. And we really appreciate everything that you did. But if we do have any questions, you can feel free to unmute your mic or you could put it in chat if you have time for that, Belinda, if that's okay.
I do. Absolutely.
If anybody has anything, also you do have her contact information there.
Absolutely.
That sounds.
It was a lot of
Yeah.
information.
No, Belinda, you did fabulous, and I do want to guide people that I was a Boy Scout leader for 12 years, and being able to use the Into the Clouds and actually it was the NetSmart curriculum, being able to augment that. But I use that because internet safety, it was interesting. You had to be safe with knives, with fire, and the internet. And I had quite a few boys that the internet safety portion was actually harder for them than the knife safety. And you put a 12-year-old boy and you give him a knife for the first time, it's amazing. But you also give them that cell phone and it's just as dangerous. And so it was really good and a privilege to be able to work with them in that capacity, using your resources and being able to get them that training and resource. It's also fabulous for schools and to be able to take those lessons, augment, be able to work on them to meet the internet safety training requirements that we have at schools. Not just to meet those requirements, but to be able to empower and help kids. So really appreciate this. This was recorded, and as soon as we'll get this posted, let me put that link to where we post these for future reference so that you'll be able to have those. 1 second, and I'll post that link in chat so that you'll be able to have access in the future. Again, this one will be up only for 1 year, and then we'll be able to take it down and be able to get you more information. Monica, if there's anything else from the TEA side before we close out, otherwise, we really do appreciate your guys' time and effort. Belinda, we really appreciate yours as well.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I have nothing, Rod. Thank you, Belinda, for great information once again. Hope everyone has a great weekend. We will get this recording up as soon as possible.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you.